We talk about geopolitics and how geography defines destiny. We usually think that geography is fixed. You know, the map of the world doesn't change. But because of the climate, the map of the world is changing. The quickest route, the quickest maritime route from East Asia to Europe is via the Arctic. If that route becomes accessible, all the manufacturing and all the industrial productivity for which Asia is so famous has an easier way to reach its markets in Europe and North America. So there are these strange opportunities that, you know, I'm not saying that climate change is a crisis, but there are these interesting opportunities that arise as well.
안녕하세요. 전 세계 화제의 책과 저자를 깊이 있게 들여다보는 시간 스텔라의 북인사이트 스텔라입니다. 올 여름 잘 보내고 계시죠? 매해 여름 최고 기온을 경신하는 게 한국만이 아닌 것 같더라고요. 유럽, 미국을 덮친 폭염에 호주는 폭우가 내리고 아프리카는 가뭄으로 기후 난민이 생겨나고 있다, 이런 뉴스가 나오는데요. 이런 뉴스가 지정학을 바꾸고 있다고 말하는 전직 영국 외교관이 있습니다. 오늘은 20년 넘게 영국 외무부 외교관으로 근무하면서 나이지리아, 예멘, 이라크, 아프가니스탄 같이 이 분쟁의 최전선을 누볐던 분을 모셨습니다. 알서 스넬과 함께 이 폭염이 어떻게 지도를 바꾸는지, 이 지리가 아닌 기후가 이 국가의 운명을 바꾼다는 게 무슨 말인지 이야기 나눠보겠습니다. Welcome to Stel's Book Insights. I'm your host, Stella Oh. Joining us today is Arthur Snell, a former diplomat, foreign policy expert, and the mastermind behind Elemental, the new geography of climate change and how we survive it. He's here with us today to completely reframe how we view geopolitics by looking at it through the urgent lens of climate change. Arthur, it's a pleasure to have you on the show.
Well, thank you. And 안녕하세요. I hope I got that right.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you for joining us today. To kick things off, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So I'm obviously from England, and I studied history at the University of Oxford in the 1990s, and then I joined the British Foreign Service at the end of the 90s. And so my professional career as a diplomat covered the years leading up to and after 9/11 and the attacks, of course, on New York and Washington, and then the geopolitical response to that, including the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. So as a diplomat, I found myself working in places affected by conflict: Iraq, Yemen, Afghanistan, Nigeria. And I think a lot of those experiences that I had in that time shaped some of the work that I have done in this book. I left the diplomatic service about 10 years ago, and I now work mostly as a writer and as an advisor, consultant on foreign policy.
You served for like over 2 decades in Foreign Office, correct?
Correct.
You know, the core thesis of the classical geopolitics is that like geography ultimately shapes a nation's destiny. What I love about this book is how it flips that idea on its head, like showing that climate change is now the force reshaping it. Like, for example, just this morning, I saw reports of renewed U.S. airstrikes on the Iranian coast and a renewal like naval blockade on Iranian ports. And whenever something like this happens, we tend to focus on like power struggles between states or bad government when there are some like bigger macro level shifts behind them. So here's what I'm curious about, like having served in some of those world's most volatile and conflict zones, what was a specific aha moment for you? Like a moment when you connected the dots to realize that climate change is a real force behind this geopolitics today?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it might be that actually there wasn't one moment, but there was a changing awareness over time. And so, for example, I worked in, as I mentioned, in North Nigeria, a place where you see a lot of ethnic conflict, a lot of conflict between tribal groups. And I think at the time, we tended to focus rather, as you observed, Stella, on things like ideology or, political governance, maybe corrupt officials or a lack of development, and those sorts of questions, which are very immediate and technical. But what we weren't looking at was the major shift that was just happening every day, every month, every year behind that, which was that because of a shift in climate, you have populations forced to move. Maybe, two groups that lived separately are now trying to live in the same area. That causes conflict, large displacements of people, governments unable to pay for their, responsibilities because of the economic impacts of these things. So I think the that gradual shift. There may be an aha moment when I remember I was in the Sahara Desert in Niger, in the Sahel region of Africa, and talking to a farmer, and he was kind of saying, I don't know why I bother farming, because it doesn't really work. And yet he's doing it probably because his ancestors did it, and that's what people did in that area. But there was this kind of realization that the shifting climate was making their way of life untenable.
Actually, I wasn't really familiar with the African geography, so I looked at where the Sahel actually is. It marks the edge of the Sahara Desert, and it stretches across a number of different countries. Am I correct?
Yes. Yes, that's right. So the Sahel region is, as you rightly say, the Sahara Desert, of course, the world's biggest desert, is there in North Africa. And the strip of land to the south of the Sahara Desert, which runs from the Atlantic Ocean on one side to the Red Sea on the other side, right across Africa, the Sahel region. And that region has had extraordinary instability in recent years. In fact, you can draw a line right across Africa, and every country on that line has experienced some kind of a military coup or a revolutionary breakdown just in the last 5 years or less. And that's an illustration of how severe these problems are becoming.
Could you briefly walk us through the structural link between the conflicts we're seeing today and the region's like deeper long-term ecological and energy decay?
Yeah, sure. Well, I think, you mentioned earlier, of course, the day we record this, the conflict over the Gulf between Iran and the United States has reignited just in the last few days. And most people would say, well, that's got nothing to do with climate. That's about power. It's about access to oil. It's about the relationship between the Muslim countries and Israel. So people might dismiss climate, but I would argue that climate is part of that story as well, because what we're looking at, we are going through the energy transition. We are at the point where the world is shifting from hydrocarbons, oil and gas, to electrification. And of course, we see this everywhere. I'm sure people in Korea are driving EVs, and a few years ago, EVs didn't exist. And we're seeing it in the UK, renewable energy sources, solar, wind, and so on. And because that is happening, the countries that are dependent on oil and gas for their energy are trying to maximize their revenues for what might be the final decades of this story. And Iran is one of those countries, but actually the United States of America is one of those countries. The US is now the world's biggest oil producer. And of course, President Trump, in my view, he's wrong, but his view is that climate change is a hoax. And so he's committed to hydrocarbons, to oil and gas. And so I see this war in the Iran and the Straits of Hormuz as the oil powers fighting for that last chapter of the oil story.
Right. That's really a fascinating shift in perspective. And I think it makes so much sense when you frame it that way. I want to start this conversation from the weather change, like extreme weather these days. Europe has been grappling with unprecedented heat waves lately. Are you in London by any chance?
Well, I actually live in the west of England, but it's the same here. We're having, day after day of very unusual hot weather. And people who know England, traditionally we talk about the rain. It's kind of cold place, a bit grey. Most people don't have air conditioning in their houses. So we're not very well adjusted in my country to hot weather.
Mm-hmm. Actually, I was in London a few weeks ago, right when it hit, and you could really see people struggling because of the reason you just mentioned. And reading your book, though, I realized that there are regions facing something far more extreme, well over 40 degrees Celsius. And that's when habitability really hits home. And this is another point I love about your book. It traces that connection all the way through, from rising sea levels and melting ice caps, redrawing the boundaries of human habitability, to natural disasters, water shortages, food security, energy security, regional conflicts, and mass migration. All these topics are tightly connected in your book, and I really loved about that. Could you break down the big picture for us again, how these weather patterns fundamentally reshaping global stability?
We are currently in Europe experiencing an extreme heat wave. Of course, I think in some other parts of North America, that's happening. We're seeing more extreme weather, and it's happening more often. And so for a long time, humanity is very good at forgetting. You have a big storm, a typhoon, a hurricane, and then a few months later, you say, well, it was just a one-off. It was a very unfortunate, but we're going to be okay now. But what we're seeing now is this is the new normal. So last summer in Europe was extremely hot. This summer is extremely hot. Next summer is going to be, and this is now the norm. And so this is happening all over the world, literally everywhere on planet Earth. These changes are happening. Some places, there's a question about habitability. So very high temperatures, but also humidity is just very difficult for human beings to continue to exist. People can die of heat exhaustion, and of course, ordinary everyday life becomes very difficult. Agriculture, construction, certain other activities, there's no way of avoiding this. So one of the impacts of this is actually mass movement of people. And we've already touched on, for example, how this might be happening in the Sahel region of Africa, but it will be happening in other regions as well, in parts of Asia, in South America, and so on. But another element of this is actually the way that it impacts how human society works. So I'm talking about food production, maritime trade, the way that communications technologies function. There are so many elements of what we think of as essential parts of our modern life that are impacted by this new change in the climate. We see that things that have happened in history that maybe happened over a few hundred years will now happen in a few short years, maybe in a decade or 2 decades. And so that's the real change is that it's like history is speeding up. And that's something very new.
In your book, you go beyond the usual Western headlines and focus on the regions bearing the real brunt of this crisis, right? What do you think is the most striking example you've seen in a community already living this reality?
There are lots of case studies. Maybe one thing we could talk about is rising sea levels. We talk about Bangladesh, a very, very low-lying country with a very large population. Already, villages are disappearing into the rising waters, and people try to move in small groups to new areas. But this is a process which is accelerating. But there are entire countries, maybe small countries, but they are still sovereign, independent nations, particularly in the Pacific, countries like Tuvalu, Vanuatu, where the possibility that the country itself continues to exist as a feasible unit is actually under question.
Honestly, like when a country feels far away and unfamiliar, it's like easy to tune out unless there's some like major headline events, right? So I'm hoping my questions can help broaden the perspective of a little bit for our viewers.
That's great. Well, I'm glad. My hope has been that this book is a guide to the future. We talk about geopolitics and how geography defines destiny. We usually think that geography is fixed, that the map of the world doesn't change. But because of the climate, the map of the world is changing. And a good example of this is the Arctic Ocean. It's sea, but it has had an ice cap for thousands of years. When I was in the 1980s, when I was a little boy, that ice cap was bigger than Australia, a massive sheet of ice. In the next decade, probably in the 2030s, in summer, that ice cap won't be there anymore. It means for the Arctic region, of course, a change in the strategic nature there. You have countries that have very difficult relationships. Obviously, Russia, Canada, United States, Nordic countries. We have the Greenland question, a question which, of course, has become very controversial. Donald Trump making claim to Greenland. These are all elements of this changing climate. But the other question, which is very important for your viewers in East Asia, is that the quickest maritime route from East Asia to Europe is via the Arctic. So historically, that route was not accessible because of the ice. If that route becomes accessible, all the manufacturing and all the industrial productivity for which Asia is so famous has an easier way to reach its markets in Europe and North America. So there are these strange opportunities that, I'm not saying that climate change is a crisis, but there are these interesting opportunities that arise as well.
Actually, since you mentioned that, like exports means a lot for Korea's economy. So the Arctic route opening up really matters to us. I think, but it's a strange mix, like worrying about the climate change behind it, but also needing to prepare for this new geopolitical map, as you mentioned. Between the Suez, the Panama, and now the Arctic, like shipping routes are shifting dramatically. You make a brilliant point about how shifting agricultural zones act as a direct catalyst for like local conflicts. But what first drew your attention to this specific connection between like agriculture and the warfare?
When I lived in Africa, one of the elements of the Sahel region in West Africa is you have different groups that have a different way of life. So there are some that live in settled communities and they grow crops and, agriculture as we normally consider it. And then others who are herders who move their animals over long distances. And traditionally, these two groups kept in separate areas. So there was not much friction between them. But because of the shifting climate, they're being forced into the same area. So imagine you're a farmer, you have your field of crops, and then, 500 cattle come through and churn everything up and destroy it. You know, these are the ways that conflicts start to break out. And it sounds like a small thing, but it's happening on a huge scale. And in fact, in West Africa, you know, there are thousands of people have become tragically have died in conflicts that relate to these sorts of questions. So that's one element of this. But the other element of this is the challenge that the world faces in feeding itself. Because as the climate shifts, it becomes harder for farmers, even high-tech agribusiness in developed economies. It's getting harder and harder for those farmers to continue to produce food at the necessary levels.
Mm-hmm, I see. So the climate change basically changed the assumptions, like underlying assumptions of geopolitics we believe so far.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, rice is obviously grown in relatively hot places, but actually rice doesn't do well above certain temperatures. So in more extreme temperatures, high 30s, low 40s, rice doesn't grow. If we're looking at the places now that are the world's biggest producers of rice, their shifting climate is going to be very difficult to continue to produce rice. Now, of course, human beings are brilliant. You know, we come up with scientific innovation. Look at the COVID vaccines, which came in a few months. You know, scientists are working on trying to re-engineer rice in order that we can continue to feed the world's population. But these are the kinds of challenges that are coming as a result of these climate changes.
I think the problem gets worse if someone just weaponizes this food. Like looking at Ukraine and Sudan, food isn't just traded anymore. It's just become a weapon of geopolitical leverage. How do you see this shift?
When people think about the war in Ukraine, I imagine most people think it's nothing to do with food. It's to do with Russia's relationship with Europe, Russia fearing NATO. They don't want to lose control of Ukraine, and they feel that Ukraine wants to join the EU and leave the Russian sphere of influence. That's all true. But it's also true that Vladimir Putin, he wrote a long essay justifying the war in Ukraine, and he talked about food and agricultural land. Ukraine is famous for having very good, very fertile agricultural land. During the Soviet period and the period of the Russian Empire, Ukraine was seen as one of the main agricultural zones of the whole of the Soviet region. And so when Putin looks at Ukraine, he's not just looking at this alignment with Europe, he's looking at the resources and the resource of Ukraine's agricultural sector. He as I say, he wrote his essay, he talked about how he feared that Ukraine would sell its agricultural land to foreign interests. And when the Russians invaded Ukraine in 2022, they seized prime agricultural land. Sudan is another example. We know that the war in Sudan is to some extent being sponsored by rival Arab states. The United Arab Emirates is sitting behind one of the armies. The Saudi Arabia and the Saudi allies is sitting behind the army of the Republic of Sudan. And again, we said, well, why do they want? What's the objective in Sudan? Well, for the Gulf Arab countries, their land is basically impossible for agriculture, completely hot, too dry. Also, for the United Arab Emirates, quite a small territory. Sudan, the biggest country in Africa, it has enormous resources. It has quite fertile areas. It is still, there are lots of opportunity for agricultural production. And particularly the UAE has always had a plan. The United Arab Emirates always had a plan as part of its food security to develop agribusiness in Sudan. So when we see this war happening in Sudan and we think it might be about Islamic questions or something to do with control of certain territory, it's also a war for food.
Interesting. That actually reframes how we see the world. Now, here's a striking contrast to everything we just discussed. Like, while the parts of a global south become like virtually uninhabitable, like northern frontiers, like the nations you just mentioned, like Canada, Siberia, are turning into new strategic agricultural zones. Like, from your perspective, like, are we facing transformation so profound that will like physically redraw or perhaps like erase the national borders we see on maps today?
Yeah, I mean, interestingly, of course, some people are already talking about this. Donald Trump says he wants to make Canada the 51st state. So he would like to erase that border. I personally don't believe that's going to be possible. But it's true that there are two immense countries on this planet that are mostly in the far north. They're Russia and Canada. Number one, number two. And of course, both of those countries, at the moment, most of the population lives in the less extremely cold area. Most of Canada's population lives close to the southern border with the United States. Most of Russia's population lives in the west, in the European zone. But if we think about the region of Russia, which is actually closer to Korea, Eastern Russia, Eastern Siberia, is hardly populated. There's almost nobody living there. There's Vladivostok, of course, a big city, but otherwise it's empty. And most of that region is a very harsh environment. You know, it's very difficult to live in. It has very severe winters. But every year, farmers in this part of Eastern Russia are finding it easier to grow and to expand their agricultural activity. So this is a new agricultural zone which is developing. And what's interesting is many of the workers in these farms are coming from China. Now, it's hard to get data because both countries, both China and Russia, this is a sensitive subject and they don't want to disclose the full story. But we know this is happening and there's lots of evidence for that. As we know, China has a historical perspective and it has made claims to lots of territory which it claims that it has a right to historically, including this part of Russia. Some official maps, some official Chinese maps will include Eastern Siberia as part of China. What we do know is that Russia's economy is very dependent on China now. Because of the Ukraine war, the Europeans have tried to cut Russia off. So Russia needs China. And so if millions of Chinese people go to live in Russia, I think the Russians can't say no. And also, actually, the Chinese will make strategic investments. They're already talking about special economic zones, building new ports, all this kind of thing. So I think there's a kind of economic colony.
Okay, now let's shift gears and talk about energy. When it comes to climate change and geopolitics, I don't think we can leave energy out of this conversation. So I want to talk about the irony of the AI revolution and the climate crisis. So we're told to go green, but the AI boom is driving a scramble for critical minerals and devouring electricity at a terrifying rate, and even bringing retired or older nuclear reactors back online just to keep the power running. And at the same time, you wrote about this ground up transition in the global south, which was very interesting, where people use cheap renewables to escape broken sacred. The first part, the AI boom driving up electricity demand, is something we hear a lot all the time. But this ground up transition in the global south was honestly something I'd never heard of before reading your book. And what have you observed about this phenomenon and what are your thoughts on where it's headed?
Yeah, well, let's talk about this ground up thing because I think that's really interesting. So the basic point is that the cheapest form of electricity generation is now renewable energy. For a long time, renewable energy had to be subsidized, and people who were critics, they would say, well, why this is pointless? Why do you pay money to generate electricity? But now, particularly solar panels, but also onshore wind energy is incredibly cheap. And that's mostly because China has started manufacturing solar PV panels at an extraordinary rate. In fact, the Chinese government is now trying to restrict the production because the price has collapsed. But for people in the global south, why this is important is that if you live in a country where the grid energy, the official national energy is very unreliable, lots of people have no access to energy or very limited. And, I mentioned that I lived in Nigeria, but both in Nigeria, Zimbabwe, Yemen, I can think of many places I've lived where if you have to rely on the national energy system, it's very difficult. Most days it cuts out. So for a lot of people, the first time that they can have reliable energy in their homes is when they buy a solar panel and put it on the roof of their house. And actually you can go on Google Earth, look at a city like maybe Karachi or a big city in South Asia, for example, and you'll see that individual houses now have thousands of these little solar panels on them. So this is the energy transition happening because individuals are making choices and it becomes so cheap that it's accessible. No, it's not because of a UN program or a government system or something. It's the market defining that. So this is a really interesting shift. But let's talk a bit about the AI because at the other end, so that's ground up, but top down, you've got billions, maybe trillions of dollars being put into AI data centers. They need masses of electricity, masses of water, of course, as well. There's already some evidence that you can do that. The processing necessary can be done in a more efficient way. But it's still true that there's a massive demand, and that demand puts, as you say, massive strain on the grid. Perhaps a need to bring on old power supplies. In some places, even bringing things like coal, the worst kind of polluting power, back online, which is, is a terrible idea. I think what we have to do is we have to start establishing norms that AI data centers can only run off renewable energy because there is enough renewable energy. The power of the sun is enough.
This is something that you just mentioned, but there's another important piece of this big picture is that the green transition comes with some tough truths, like democracies from the UK to South Korea depend like heavily on Gulf oil money and Chinese markets to get there. It's another like strange irony, I think, like chasing an eco-friendly future while relying on authoritarian regimes that don't share our values. Do you think we are locking ourselves into like permanent dependency trap?
And I think it's one that I probably people in Korea know more about than I do, because the big question is the role of China. China has dominated and will dominate the energy transition. And that's because China took a strategic decision to both with technology, but also with resources, the rare earths, the critical minerals all over Africa, mines that were perhaps once owned by like an Australian company, now owned by a Chinese company. The processing of critical minerals is being controlled by Chinese economic interests. So all this is happening, and many countries, for very good reasons, are very nervous about being reliant completely on a Chinese technology platform. Of course, what's interesting is that one of the few countries in the world that offers an alternative with its own technology and its own manufacturing is your country, is South Korea. Unfortunately, Europe has kind of missed out on a lot of the manufacturing capability. And in fact, I write in the book about an attempt to make a big battery plant, a gigafactory for batteries in the north of Sweden, which was unsuccessful, partly because of the European economic model, but I think partly possibly because of industrial sabotage by the Chinese. So that's, these are the challenges we face. But actually, I come back to South Korea and to other Asian economies. As we know, China is not the only country that can make things. And Korea has led the world in making things, whether it's cars, boats, technology, telephones, you name it. So I think one of the things we have to do as democracies is work more together.
That's like much more hopeful picture than the headline suggests. Yeah. Honestly, I hate like cynicism. Like I always try to focus on conversation and what actually possible. Listening to all of this, like it's easy to feel like pretty pessimistic, but history often shows that global trends are rarely linear, like largely because we're constantly reshaped by human wills and effort. Amid this like pervasive climate pessimism these days we see today, if we go look for like reasons to hope, what do you find?
Is that actually humanity has already changed. So we have already passed the peak of hydrocarbon consumption. That was probably 2 years ago. So you and me and everyone, we've lived through this turning point in world history, and we're already on the down slope. Now, we should be quicker. That's where we can have the debate. But we've actually already accomplished this major, because we are not deindustrializing. We've done this, but we're still expanding the world economy. We're still developing new technologies. We're still improving the quality of life of people in the global south. So actually, we have already shown that it is possible to make the transition and continue to live in the way that we in the modern world expect to live.
That's a great answer. It's time for my signature question here at Saul's website. As a foreign policy expert in the next 10 years, what do you think will change the most, and what will never change, like remain constant?
Yeah. Well, I think the thing that will remain constant is actually, because we touched on this earlier, the map of the world, the countries in it, that there is going to be a lot of turbulence, a lot of complex politics, but actually the nation state remains the basic unit of how countries operate. I think what will change the most is actually the way that particularly countries in the global north and countries that have an alliance of values. So I'm talking about liberal democratic capitalist societies. They will start to work together much more closely. And we've seen, Mark Carney is Prime Minister of Canada, has kind of pointed the way that what we might call middle powers have to work together more, because we've realized that whether we're talking about China or the United States, it's not enough to hope that some big country is going to look after you. You have to start looking after yourself. So the way that rather than these closed clubs like the EU or some other regional clubs, what we're going to see is middle powers, liberal democracies across the world starting to collaborate much more closely.
That's a wonderful answer. Before we close, I'd like to ask you this question. Like in the dedication of your book, you left a profoundly moving tribute to all those who have paid for the climate crisis with their lives. What is the core message you hope readers take away from your book, and what does that dedication mean to you?
Well, I think the core message is one that we are living in this scary and unpredictable time, but it is not the end of humanity. We are going to be here. And of course, I wanted to mention those people in the dedication because not everybody is going to be here. And you know, life is full of tragedy, but it's also full of birth and renewal and hope. And we have to recognize and show some awareness of those people who have suffered the most. But we also have to remember that we, humanity, we have everything we need to solve this problem. We don't need to invent some new solution. We have the technology, we have the capability. We just have to work together to make it happen.
I see. That's a really powerful way to end this. As a brief follow-up, do you have a particular message you'd like to share with our audience?
Well, I think particularly it's a great honor for me to be published in the Korean language. It's a country I've never been able to visit, but it's a country I have taken a lot of interest in over a long period, particularly because the region I come from, Gloucestershire, which is in the west of England, during the Korean War, a lot of people from my region served in Korea. So I grew up hearing stories about Korea, about the fight for freedom, about the connection that we have in my little part of England to your wonderful country. And so I'm just very honored that we had the chance to speak today.
Thank you so much. I hope there's a chance for you to visit Korea someday.
One day, I hope so.
Arthur, thank you so much for being here with us today and sharing your insight. It was truly wonderful having you.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
오늘의 대화 어떠셨나요? 이 호르무즈 해협이 위협받을 때 우리는 늘 누가 누구와 힘겨루기를 하는지 이 국가 간 관계 위주로 주목하죠. 그런데 기후가 이 국가 간 관계를 다시 그리고 있다라는 시각은 오늘 저자가 던져준 새로운 관점이었던 것 같습니다. 기후변화는 우리가 대응해야 할 위기이면서도 동시에 우리가 기회로 만들어가야 할 우리가 살아가야 하는 현실이니까요. 이 인터뷰가 지정학을 바라보는 여러분의 시야를 조금 더 넓히는 데 도움이 되었길 바라는 마음으로 스텔라의 북인사이트 저희는 다음 시간에도 좋은 책과 저자로 찾아오겠습니다. 만나보고 싶은 저자나 다뤄보고 싶은 책이 있다면 댓글로 달아주세요. 좋아요 잊지 마시고요. 우리 여기서도 자주 오래 봐요.